It is Friday. You made it to the weekend. Welcome back to another episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. Hope you've enjoyed your week, and I hope you're ready for the weekend. And man, I know I've done a lot of complaining about the heat, but I don't know about where you may be at today or where you're going to be this weekend, but the mild temperatures are back, folks, at least in my neck of the woods. We're going to have highs in the low 80s, maybe even the upper 70s in August. In August, give me that all day, or every day, I should say. I'm sure it won't last too long, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to enjoy the weekend and the mild temperatures that are supposed to come along with it. And hopefully you will do the same. Got a good show in store for you, as always. Kyler Staley is going to stop by here in a few minutes, and we dive quite extensively into Indiana men's basketball and what their expectations might be, or should be, I should say, for the upcoming season. Something Kyler and I haven't really talked a whole lot about on the 3 times he had been on so far. We talked TBT, talked a little bit of Big Ten football media days in his second segment, and basketball is kind of his specialty. So finally give him a chance to talk about more of his expertise. And I believe it's a good conversation. Hopefully you enjoy it as well whenever we get that rolling here in a few minutes. Want to address some comments here from the last show on the YouTubes on HoosierIllustrated.com. Thank you to all of those who sent in your thoughts about the show and what you liked or maybe disliked. You can also hit the hotline as well, 502-830-9195, if that is more your speed. Justin says Final Fantasy is greater than fantasy football. I like that little Easter egg comment right there, referencing how I accidentally, or nearly, I should say, refer to fantasy football as Final Fantasy. And if that's any indication of whether or not I should participate in fantasy football, then maybe I shouldn't if Final Fantasy happens to be better than fantasy football. Forrest says, y'all have no idea what hot is. 104 with the 111 heat index here today. Well, that, my friend, if that's the case where you're at, or, was the case, I should say, then kudos to you for sticking that out, because I will stay in air conditioning all day if it's 104 degrees with that type of heat index. So shout out to Mr. Forrest for thank you for leaving a comment, sir. And then here's a lengthy one, and we'll move forward after this. This is from Myron. He says, best thing about football season is that basketball follows it. Can't wait for IU basketball to kick the backsides of the opponents. We have 8 D1 starters back. Yes, 8. I didn't even know that. Shout out to Myron for that little tidbit right there. 90 points and almost 29 rebounds back. Renew, Mbako, Ballo, Galloway, Carlisle, and Rice all scored in double figures. 3 5-year players, great size, athleticism. Go IU, win the Big Ten. Go Woody, and prove the doubters wrong. Now that's somebody who is clearly hyped. And I tell you what, you brought the stats to back it up, and those are some obscure stats. 8 D1 starters back. Now, obviously, you can't start 8 players on a college basketball floor, or really any basketball floor, if we're being honest. That means 3 guys who were key contributors for other teams last year potentially won't be in the starting lineup, or even potentially some Indiana guys. One thing that Kyler and I talk about here in the segment that you'll hear momentarily is what's Trey Galloway's role going to be next year, because it seemed like he's kind of been a utility of sorts over the course of his playing career with the Hoosiers, because he's not always been a true point guard. He's not always been a true 2 guard. He's really always kind of been thrust into whatever position needed the most help. And I do think that somebody like him, I mean, it wouldn't even surprise me if, due to the amount of talent on the guard or with the guard position this year, it wouldn't surprise me if you see Trey Galloway go back to being a 6th man. And is that the best fit for him? It's worked for him in the past. Will he be happy about that considering he's a fifth-year player? I mean, only he knows that. But for somebody who has given so much to the Indiana program already and decided to stick around for his final season of eligibility, his COVID year of eligibility, I should say, I would say he's willing to do whatever it takes. If he was unhappy, he would have left. And he knows that Mike Woodson and staff, or whoever the head man is, I should say, is going to do whatever it takes to put his team in a position to win. And if that means sacrificing some minutes, I'd be willing to think that Trey Galloway and hopefully other guys on this team are willing to take that step back if necessary. Now, am I predicting he's sixth man for Indiana? I won't necessarily say that just yet. It wouldn't surprise me. It really all comes down to his health, obviously, for number one, and then whether guys like Kanan Carlisle or Miles Rice end up being what they're built up to be. Miles Rice coming off a season where he was Pac-12 Freshman of the Year. Kanan Carlisle with a lot of NBA upside, supposedly. So that's the guard spot in particular, who runs the one. That's going to be interesting to see. I don't think Trey Galloway will be running the one. I'll go ahead and say that, at least primarily. There will be times where he is relied upon to do that, obviously, and take care of the ball. But I think you're primarily going to see guys like Kanan Carlisle or Miles Rice in that role, and even Gabe Cupps off the bench. I don't think Gabe Cupps really fits that two-guard spot. Maybe he improves his shooting, or maybe what I should say is maybe he has improved in his shooting this offseason and maybe moves forward into a role. I doubt it, but again, crazier things have happened. So we'll dive into a little more Indiana basketball with Kyler Staley here shortly. But let's hit on a quick few other things before we dive into that conversation. I feel like ever since I've mentioned not liking preseason lists and the like, that I've continued to mention them. So, and it's not that I dislike like kind of seeing who's projected to do well. That's fine. I just hate that it sometimes draws false hope for certain players, especially when the lists are so extensive and they feature 50 to 100 players, something like that. That just seems unnecessary. Put 10 to 15 guys on a watch list. And if throughout the year somebody, takes more attention away from the guys who were on those initial lists, then obviously that's what the midseason watch lists are for. Anyway, I'm probably doing a little too much complaining about the watch list, because anyway, I'm about to reference another one, and that is the Comeback Player of the Year watch list. And the reason I'm pointing this one out, there's an Indiana guy on this list. And this is for football, by the way. And I like a list like this, and that's why I'm naming it, because this is a group of people, and let's see how many are on this list. There's a significant amount of guys on this list, but it is guys who are coming back from injury, illness, or what other circumstance it may be that kept them from playing a lot last year. And Indiana's own running back Solomon Van Horse made this list. This is going to be, believe it or not, and I know this isn't completely out of the ordinary nowadays, considering you have the COVID year. And thankfully, this is the final year of the COVID additional year of eligibility. Everything kind of goes back to normal after this. But this will be Solomon Van Horse's. And by the way, I know I'm stun locking myself right now. I've done it a couple of times already talking about this, but what a name. You're a running back and your last name is Van Horse. I mean, people a lot of times refer to tough running backs as workhorses of the offense for a football team. And what a name to have as a running back, Solomon Van Horse. And I wish him all the best this year for Indiana football. But anyway, this is his 7th season of college football. 3 additional years. And many of these, especially nowadays, obviously you have the COVID year, which gives you the additional year of eligibility. If you redshirt, that gives you an additional year of eligibility. and you can get a medical red shirt, which I'm assuming that's part of his package, if you will, as well. This is his 7th year for Solomon Van Horst. He's missed 20 of his potential 24 games over the last 2 seasons, including the final 12 of 2023. Previously, he was 3rd team All-Colonial Athletic Association, and he became the 39th player in FBS or FCS to return a kickoff for a touchdown, among other things. So we'll see what he ends up doing. Obviously, Indiana's running back room is very crowded. And really these days, no matter which team you look at, the running back's position is often a running back by committee. Not very often anymore do you see a workhorse running back, as I mentioned. It's a lot of times you have 2 to 3 guys, sometimes 4 guys, who end up getting the majority of the reps or a certain number of reps throughout each game. And I think you'll see guys, I'm sure Justice Ellison will be one of your primary backs. And then you got a couple of JMU transfers in Kalon Black and Tyson Lawton. And then Solomon Van Horst may be in the mix as well. So it'll be interesting to see who comes out on top. And I guess, ends up being that primary back. And it may not matter. It may vary by game depending on the style of running that each player has. Someone may be more up the middle, and they may just be a beefier back, and they can really take on the line and not be afraid to absorb some of those tackles. Or you may have some more finesse style players where they're more likely to cause a defender to fall on his face or fall on his back and kind of juke him out of the way. And I know that wasn't the most eloquent way to maybe describe what a player might do, but there's different styles in which, running backs can approach depending on their body type and the like and that type of stuff. So I'm excited for football as always. And again, Solomon Van Horst on that list for comeback player of the year. And while we're on watch, let's go ahead and knock out the last of the preseason accolades for some of these Indiana guys. A few have already mentioned. We'll go ahead and go through all of them. Obviously, I just mentioned Solomon Van Horst for comeback player of the year. James Bamba nominated for the AFCA Good Works team and the All-State Werfel Trophy. James Evans, Ray Guy Award. I believe I mentioned that previously. D'Angelo Pons, the Lott Trophy, and Elijah Surratt, the Biletnikoff Award preseason watch list. So there you have it. Some of the guys to potentially keep an eye on. And again, like I said, these watch lists typically don't really cover like who ends up really being the best of the best. There could be like Donovan McCulley. Surprised to not see him on some preseason watch lists, unless there's something he's been included on that I haven't seen yet. But I believe he'll be one of Indiana's top receivers this year. So we'll have to wait and see what ends up happening for that. One other thing, and then we'll dive into Kyler Staley. Braylon Mullins was named the top 3-point shooter of the summer by an ESPN analyst who rates some of the top guys in terms of high school basketball prospects. And obviously, for those who don't know, I'm sure many of you do know, Braylon Mullins, one of the top targets for Indiana men's basketball for the class of 2025. And being a 3-point shooter and being named the top 3-point shooter, that's got to make Indiana fans excited, because as we've mentioned time and again over Mike Woodson's first couple of years, 2 to 3 years, I should say, shooting hasn't been, I don't want to say it hasn't been a priority. I guess that really has been the case. It's just been lacking. And to have that been addressed not only this year, but you're already preparing for the future by prioritizing guys like Mullins. And not only that, him being an in-state guy is also something that really excites fans, especially those who've grown up watching Indiana high school basketball and love that being a part of the IU basketball tradition. So Braylon Mullins, I'm sure he will continue to be a priority for Indiana. And he's also a priority for a lot of other schools now. He skyrocketed up many high school basketball prospect rankings, no matter you look at Rivals, 24/7 Sports, On3, whatever it may be. Braylon Mullins has quickly become one of the top names of the entire country. Let's see, he's taken visits to UConn. He's got visits coming up to Michigan, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky. And that's just, he's just got a lot of, I guess, hype surrounding his recruitment right now that he wasn't getting at this time last year. And then obviously you've got some other guys too that Indiana's focusing on. A lot of the Indiana elite guys, Trent Sisley, Malachi Moreno, those are guys to also keep an eye on. Trent Sisley, though, no longer going to be playing his high school ball in Indiana. He's made the move down to Montverde Academy, which again, Mike Woodson and Indiana have had really good ties to. So it wouldn't surprise me if him making the move to Montverde significantly improves Indiana's chances at landing somebody like Trent Sisley. So, and then I guess since I've already mentioned Malachi Moreno, I guess he's a Georgetown guy here in Kentucky, and it wouldn't surprise me if he ends up being one of Mark Pope's kind of top priorities for the season. So he may be on the more difficult side to try to convince to come over to the Hoosiers, but again, he is somebody that Indiana has also prioritized this recruiting cycle. So we'll also keep an eye on that as those things develop over the course of the year, and we'll see what Indiana has in store for the future of their freshman class in 2025. So we'll go ahead and put a bow on that. And without further ado, we're going to welcome in Kyler Staley, staff writer at HoosierIllustrated.com, and we'll continue this conversation on Indiana men's basketball. And we'll get into a few other things as well. So right now, I'm going to let it roll. Joining me now on today's episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com, is the king himself, King Kyler Staley. And we were talking about this before the show, as a matter of fact. But I've given him the crown of king for now. Not only does it sound good, but he is currently the king of the guest appearances. This is appearance number 3 for our man Kyler Staley here on the show, and I'm glad to have you back, my man.
Hey, it's great to be here, but I'm going to tell you right now, once you give me the official title of king, I mean, that's it. It can't be taken away or whatever. So
that's true.
I'm officially the king right now when it comes to guests, and I'm going to wear that badge of honor. I'm going to wear that crown of honor there. So
and make sure you wear it around Alec, especially.
Oh, I will. I love to get at Alec anytime I can when it comes to this type of stuff. So I'll make sure he knows this moving forward. So, but it's
real quick. So
here.
You and I are going to get into some basketball talk, but I've got to get your opinion on something real quick, because I gauged the listeners on Wednesday, and I'll get into more of this during, I guess, the solo segments of the episode for Friday. But I've been asked by a couple different people now to join a fantasy football group, and I've, believe it or not, never done fantasy football.
Wow.
And I'm the kind of person where if I'm going to do something, really no matter what it is, whether it's a fun thing or a business venture, whatever that kind of stuff may be, I've got to go all in on it. And I'm afraid if I commit to doing fantasy football, that I'm not going to be all in on it, and it's going to be a waste of my time. So what are your thoughts? Should I do it, Kyler, or just kind of leave it be? There's no reason. I'm already late to the party, so why jump in now? Is kind of my thought process with all
right. I mean, so I'm trying to think. I think I've been in a fantasy football league or leagues, maybe going on 10 years now or whatever. So it's one of my favorite times of the year. I love fantasy football. It's super fun, especially when you get with a good group of guys or whatever. My advice to you, just for the sake of the league, and it's one of my pet peeves when it comes to fantasy football for people that don't, let's say, their team is going, they've only won 3 games and you're going into week 11 and stuff. It's just not worth it or whatever. My advice to you is just throughout the entire season, take care of it, take care of your team. It makes it fun for everybody else in the league or whatever and stuff. So especially if you have playoff implications and things like that. So my advice to you, do it. It'll be really fun. It'll feel like you're actually owning a team in some ways and stuff. Another advice for you, make sure you take care of your waiver wire priorities each week, because the fantasy football leagues are won on the waiver wire. So
you're speaking a foreign language to me right now. I think one thing that I think could be fun if I decide to jump into the world of fantasy football is not doing any research beforehand and just kind of diving in and see what I can figure out on my own. I think that could add a level of intrigue just for me personally,
Yeah.
just to see what kind of experiment it would end up being for myself.
Yeah, I mean, it's no different than, playing a video game in a lot of ways, building your own team or whatever. Obviously, you got matchups each week. Make sure you don't play injured players or players that are going to be out. Make sure they're on your bench, or you won't get any points that way. But yeah, that's my advice. Take care of the waiver wires, basically free agency. Anybody that's in the league that's not picked up by somebody, make sure you're sending in your bids, each and every week to try to get the guys or whatever, because I think it's one on the waiver wire, whoever picks up the best players throughout there or whatever. Are you doing a live draft? Are you doing an automatic draft? Would you know what it is?
It's a good question. So the two different people who have asked me, they haven't given me a ton of specifics. I do think one of the people who asked me said that we would draft the next time they're in town, whenever that is. I'm assuming it would be in the very near future. So again, it's all new to me, but I guess I might figure it out as I go.
Yeah. My big advice there, this is the last piece of advice I'll give you with fantasy football, is running backs are very, very rare. Good running backs are very, very rare in the NFL. So make sure you prioritize running backs. Depending on how many roster spots you have, you could have two running backs in your starting lineup or whatever. Make sure you prioritize that and get the two best possible running backs you can possibly get. If you're going to draft, don't panic and think you got to draft a quarterback, in the first 2 rounds or whatever, because there's a lot of good quarterbacks out there, so they'll get you a lot of points. But running backs, if you get a really good running back that can really lead your team throughout the season, I mean, you're pretty much set. So that's always my strategy. Try to knock out the running backs right off the bat and everything. Make sure I have a good depth chart there, and then kind of fill in the pieces there. I mostly don't even really draft quarterbacks until probably about the 6th to 8th round. And that's just, if there's a quarterback out there that I feel like is going to really, really help me there. But I mean, quarterbacks are a dime a dozen in the league. They're going to get you a lot of points no matter what. So,
well, if I decide to partake, I'll definitely keep you in the loop on how things go. I may be terrible. Maybe I'll be the luckiest man in the world and win for the first time in my first league, but I wouldn't bet on it, of course. But
yeah, please do. When you're drafting, I've got my phone. I'm on call, so just shoot me a text. If you're struggling with two different players, just shoot me a text and I'll tell you the answer right away. So
you sound like you take it pretty seriously. I like the way you roll.
I do take it pretty serious. It's fun. I love the NFL. I love the fall. College football, NFL, you can't beat it. And basketball starts right at the halfway point. So I mean, we're getting into my favorite time of the year, and I'm just really, really excited.
I'm excited as well, and we'll go ahead and dive into a little Indiana basketball discussion, because believe it or not, the other 2 times that Kyler and I have been on, we haven't really talked a lot of Indiana basketball. We talked TBT because the very first episode, it was right after Assembly Ball bowed out in that tournament, and then last week we reacted to a little bit of Media Day stuff. So this time around, we're going to talk a little Indiana basketball. We did the same thing with Alec earlier this week as well, and I guess we'll just start with expectations and what's kind of on the table. One of the big talking points going into this year will be Mike Woodson's job security, of course. Will he be able to do enough to retain and kind of re-energize the fan base? And I feel like he's put together a roster that on paper should be one of the top 2, 3, and probably 4 at worst teams in the Big Ten. And I don't mean to sound homerish. I just really think that's what they put together on the, over the offseason. And I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are on that, Kyler.
Yeah, I mean, obviously pretty loaded question when you just think about the expectations for Indiana. But I mean, I guess it comes down to, this is the most talented, on paper, the most talented team that Mike Woodson's put together in his 4 years at Indiana. The expectations have never been higher, even though they're coming off a very lackluster year. And we can get into that a little bit, down the road or whatever. But, they're coming off a lackluster year. Mike Woodson and his staff, I mean, you've heard it multiple times from different media outlets and, the national media. Mike Woodson and his staff did a phenomenal job this summer. Really did. They had to replace 6 players, some to the graduations, Chloe, we're going to the NBA, and then, 3 transfers. And plus they also had that open scholarship. They filled it with 7 guys that fit a perfect role for this team. And then most of those guys, they filled a need for Indiana. Obviously, they needed to get better in the backcourt, to get, more dynamic in the backcourt, more playmakers. And they did that with Miles Rice and Cannon Carlisle, two guys that are very, very versatile, in the backcourt. And then obviously they needed to go after shooting. They did that with Luke Goody, the guy that's got Indiana ties. He's got the state of Indiana ties, with it. It just made a whole lot of sense. He's an experienced guy. And I think one of the more underrated parts of bringing in a guy like Luke Goody is he's been in the Big Ten for 4 years. So he knows what to expect. He's going to go right in. He knows what to expect. Indiana fans expect out of him. Then you look at the front court. Obviously, they needed depth there. They lost a lot of front court pieces, and they really only had Malik Renew coming back from a season ago. And then you can also throw in Mackenzie Mbako in there as well, just because, he played a little bit of four towards the end of the season there. They went and got probably the best player, the best prospect in the transfer portal, in Omar Ballo. Very one-dimensional player, but he does what he does best, obviously, and that's score around the rim, and he's just be a force in the paint. He's not going to guy that's going to stretch the floor or anything. He's not Khalil Ware. He's very, very different type of center than what Khalil Ware. Khalil Ware was more of a finesse center. Omar Ballo is a more ground and pound guy. He's just going to use his body. And then you got some depth pieces with, Langdon Hatton and then Dallas James, who I think more, I don't know how much we've talked about Dallas James on this show yet, but I think he's more of a guy that they needed as far as a practice player, just for more depth in that way. Because you look at it, Omar Ballo needs to go up against guys that are his size or bigger, in practice. Going up against Malik Renew wasn't going to do any good because they were just going to beat each other up throughout the year. So getting a guy like Dallas James was great. Langdon Hatton, I think, is a very underrated pickup. He's obviously going to be a spot minute guy there. But I think he's going to play his role just great. And he's another experienced guy, another guy that's from the state. And then we also, kind of the wild card of this whole new group coming in, and Bryson Tucker, the 5-star wing. Don't really know what his role is going to be. I expect him to
You
play.
can almost put Ja'Kai Newton in that role, in that category as well. Even though he's not new to the team, he will be new in regards to how he fits with the dynamic of the roster.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those two are definitely the wild cards of this whole group. Obviously I just went down, a whole rabbit hole of the transfers and the new players that came in. But, back to the expectations, obviously, are this Indiana team needs to compete for a Big Ten championship. That's first and foremost. There's going to be some conversations at the end of the year. I wouldn't go as far as to say Mike Woodson is on the hot seat right now. I wouldn't go as far to say that right now. I think that's a little bit extreme. Just like I thought it was really, really extreme last season for the fan base to go after him. I just thought it was very, very extreme. I think it's extreme now to put there's a lot of pressure on Mike Woodson, and I'm not disagreeing with that. But this team just really needs to compete at the end of the day. This team has to win games. The games that they have on their schedule, the non-conference games, the games that they should win by 20 plus points, they got to do that. That's what really, really hurt them at when you look at, their NCAA tournament, hopes last year. Yeah, they won 19 games. The Big Ten was down a little bit or whatever. But one of the main reasons is when you look at, the Ken Palm ratings and things like that, Indiana just wasn't winning the games that they should dominate. They just weren't winning those types of games like that. So that really, really hurt them. And obviously that hurt their NCAA tournament chances. They got to do that. For Mike Woodson to be really, really safe with his job, and I think for the Indiana fan base to just kind of relax just a little bit, Indiana has to be a for sure tournament team throughout the whole season. They can't be bouncing on the bubble. They just can't be like that. They've got to be like they were for the most of Trace Jackson Davis' senior year. They got to be a for sure team, a 5th seed or better, in my opinion. They just got to be in that. They just can't be on the bubble, and for the big part. And then obviously, the pressure of this team needs to go deep into the NCAA tournament. That's a little far as down the road. Obviously Mike Woodson's a one game at a time type of guy. In his mind right now, yes, he wants to be in the NCAA tournament, but at the same time, he wants to be competing for a Big Ten championship. And this team's got it. The Big Ten, I think, is going to be a little bit better this year than it was last year. Obviously, Zach Edey's not there anymore, so it's pretty wide open. And then obviously you've got the wild cards of, the Pac-12 teams coming in. You don't really know what they're going to bring, but a lot of expectations for Indiana, high expectations, and rightfully so. It just comes down at the end of the day, this team's got to compete, and they got to prove, the talent that they accumulated this offseason. They got to show it on the floor, and the returners that are coming back, they got to show improvement at the end of the day. I think the pieces all fit really well together. I think the inside-out game that Mike Woodson wants to play with Umar Ballo and, Malik Renew. I think it's going to work this year just because they have shooters and they have dynamic guard play. I know inside out, playing inside, kind of makes Indiana fans cringe just a little bit.
Well, and that's what I was going to get into next. And I don't mean to interrupt, but
no, go ahead.
A lot of people, like as you were just mentioning, gripe about the play style. And I do kind of understand it to an extent. Like you want to be able to watch an entertaining style of basketball. And to me, entertaining, I mean, it can mean a lot of things, but ultimately, no matter what, if you win, I think that's entertainment enough when it comes to what the core fan base expects from the Indiana basketball program. And you mentioned the different pieces that are around what will likely be the centerpiece, no pun intended, being Umar Ballo of this year's Indiana basketball team. But the biggest piece that was missing not only last year, but really in the previous 3 years of Mike Woodson was really good shooters. And you hit the nail on the head earlier. Guys like Luke Goody, who are supposed to come in and really fill that role. And maybe even guys like Bryson Tucker, Mackenzie Mbako, if he can show that he's well improved. And I know he improved over the course of last season, but if he can take a big step forward, because obviously he has NBA aspirations, as do a few other guys on this team. But if enough of these guys take that step forward and add to the games the way that they're expected to and hope to, then that's really what's going to determine the ceiling of this year's Indiana basketball team.
Yeah, absolutely. And just sticking with shooting, in my personal opinion, I think the roster that's put together, I think this will be, and it is a small sample size, obviously, with only being 4 years, this will be the best shooting team that Mike Woodson's got. By far. And I think people are overlooking the fact, and I think on the national media side of things, people are looking like, okay, Luke Goody's really the only shooter, the proven shooter on that team. I think people are kind of overlooking the fact, what about the improvements that a guy like a Gabe Cupps could make? What about improvement? Obviously, Mackenzie Mbako, he shot the ball phenomenally in the last half of the Big Ten, shot the ball really well. And then I also think guys like Miles Rice and Kanan Carlisle, and I also even think Trey Galloway is going to shoot the ball a ton better than what they showed last year. Obviously, Miles Rice and Kanan Carlisle, they had 1 year at different schools or whatever. They were young players, and obviously they got 1 year under their belt. They don't have a whole lot of pressure on them this season. They go to a team that obviously knows what they're going to play through, and they can just do their thing at the end of the day and not have that pressure of they got to be the knockdown scorers or whatever. Trey Galloway, you look at, he had a lot of pressure on him last year, a lot of pressure. That backcourt depth was awful. And obviously, when you look at what he had to do, and a lot of knock was on Trey Galloway. So a lot of things that he had to do was very, very uncomfortable for him in a lot of ways, because that's just not his role. He had to be the point guard. He had to be the lead guard. And with that, it's no joke. I mean, obviously his shooting numbers were going to go down because of just how much stuff he had to do on, for the team last year. So if you pump the brakes just a little bit on the shooting, I think Indiana really is going to have a really good shooting team. And that, in that turn, it'll make that inside out game much more successful this season.
I was going to talk about Trey Galloway. Do you think that you'll see him play the point guard in any way, shape, or form this year? Because I think, and obviously he'll be relied on to carry the ball and, not make stupid plays with the ball. But I do think he'll be able to ease back into being more of that two-guard type of player when you got guys like Kanan Carlisle, Miles Rice that will, I'm sure Kanan Carlisle will be at the one starting for the year. And I'm sure do you think Miles Rice comes off the bench for him with the dynamic of the different guards Indiana has? It does feel like a lot of them play similarly. So it'll be interesting to see what, I guess, kind of the depth chart looks like for that group specifically.
Yeah, before we deep dive into Trey Galloway, I think the depth chart is obviously, I think Miles Rice is your number one guard. That's your number one guard. You go with him. I think he's the more proven and more well-rounded guard of this group right now. And then you also just have the question of, do you prefer Trey Galloway to start? Do you prefer him to come off the bench? Do you want Kanan Carlisle to start? It's just down to those two. And then obviously the other spots, Mackenzie Mbako, Malik Renew, Omar Ballo, those guys obviously know that you're going to start there. So with Trey Galloway, I think this season, barring that he comes back from his injury fully healthy, which it sounds like all signs are pointing towards that, I think you're going to get peak Trey Galloway as a basketball player this year. Especially if he goes back to a role of, he doesn't have a whole lot of pressure. He's going to be that kind of two guard. He's probably going to be that role, with 2 years ago where he was paired with Jalen Hood-Schifino. Mike Woodson's a big advocate. When he came in, he wants multiple ball handlers, and he wants 2 primary ball handlers on the floor at all times. He wants 2 playmakers on the floor at all times. Trey Galloway really improved last season because he was kind of forced to. He really improved as a playmaker, and I think that's going to be great. Same time this year, yes, he's going to be a great playmaker. He's going to build off of what last year was, but he doesn't have all that pressure to create. He doesn't have all that pressure to make a bunch of shots. He can go back to a slashing, style of play. If you want to go with bench Trey Galloway, if you want him to be the 6th man of the team, I think he was one. I think 6-man Trey Galloway was just a different beast, the past few years that we saw. And I think that was a role that he was comfortable with. A guy that can see what the game is like right off the bat, come in, provide that spark, and be that wild man, is like, Mike Woodson likes to call him. He can do that. But I think a lot of pressure is off Trey Galloway this year. I do think at times you will see him play the point, just depending on how the game goes or whatnot, depending on how you want to use a guy like Miles Rice, a guy like Cannon Carlisle. I think you'll see that at times, but at the same time, you won't see it as much, obviously, as you did last year, barring any injuries, hoping that there's no injuries, involved with that. But this backcourt, just depth, and we haven't even really talked about Gabe Cupps. Obviously, I think he's going to be a very sneaky piece to this team this year, a guy that also is not going to have a ton of pressure on him like he did last year, a guy that can kind of just, get better. He looks like he's gotten a lot better in the offseason. He's a lot more comfortable in the college game. So, the depth of that, then you also throw in, obviously, the wild card of Ja'Kai Newton. What's he going to bring? Is he going to play a lot? Is he going to be healthy? Those are just big questions there. But the depth pieces of every single spot of this Indiana team is their strength right now. It's the strength of that. So, any injuries that come, throughout the season, because, knock on wood, you don't want any injuries, but more than likely there's going to be times where people are injured and just can't play. So
especially the one injury that you really can't afford is Umar Ballo, because nothing against Langdon Hatton and Dallas James, but you virtually lose almost, not only your style of offense. I know Langdon Hatton could probably fill the role to an extent, but both of those guys are going to be used very sparingly just to give Umar Ballo a breather. So I'd say that's probably the one guy you can't afford to have get injured. But I guess moving on to, I got one more big question for you, Kyler, and that's, if you think there's, or do you think there's kind of like one particular player that has to really kind of not necessarily be the X factor, but really take the next step forward in order for Indiana to get to the pinnacle of what this team could be? At the very, let's just say winning the Big Ten title is the first ultimate goal for this team, as it should be. What has to take place, and who would you say is the most important part of that?
So if we're looking at the X factor, I think for this team, I think you narrow it down to the returners that come back. You want to see improvements in there. In my opinion, for X factor, it comes down to 2 guys, Mackenzie Mbako, Malik Renew. For the sake of this, just picking one guy, I'm going to go with Mackenzie Mbako. Obviously, there was a lot of, people were very impatient with Mackenzie Mbako last year at the beginning of the season. He had that 5-star tag, the McDonald's All-American tag. But, as the media was just kind of on him, he's not producing, or the fan base, he's not producing. What is this guy? I thought he was a 5-star. Mike Woodson was right all along, and I know a lot of fans don't want to admit that. The college game is much different than the high school game, much different than the AAU game.
And high schoolers, I don't mean to interrupt, but you can look at the Kentucky teams of the last several years. They're built on freshman All-Americans. The high school players of the last 3 to 4 years, really since COVID, I feel like they're not as NBA ready as the freshmen were from 10 plus years ago. It's not the same caliber of player, or at least style of player, that you were getting back in those days.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, a lot of pressure was on Mackenzie Mbako. He was billed as a great shooter, a guy that was just going to take over, for this team. It took him a long time. It took him half the year pretty much for him to figure out the college game. People often forget Jalen Hood-Schifino really, really struggled when he first got to Indiana. Really struggled. And then obviously he was forced into being that, that primary point guard, that primary guard. When Xavier Johnson went down, he grew up really, really fast there. And that ended up being the best thing for him. Mike Woodson had Mackenzie Mbako on a short leash last year. Obviously, there was times at the beginning of the season, if you remember, he was not a part of that closing lineup, was not a part of it. There was a lot of times where he didn't play the last half of the second half. But he got better, and he just improved, became a guy that can make a play off the bounce, a guy that could shoot the ball, got much better shooting from behind the arc. I think this season It's just going to be, he's going to have to show tons of improvement, a lot more consistency. Obviously, he's going to have to be good from start to finish for the season. I think there's a world out there where he is the leading scorer of this team. I think it would come down to him and Malik Renew. Malik Renew is going to do his thing. Obviously with Malik, you want to see him just improve his outside game just a little bit. You want to see him stretch the floor, stay on the floor, clean up those foul troubles. Do not be in foul trouble because that hurts Indiana at the end of the day. I want to see him, me personally, I want to see him a lot better in double team situations. I want to see him kind of mirror how Trace Jackson Davis was. That double teams come and he's either going to pass the ball out or he's like, bam, he's going straight to the basket. I want to see more of that from Malik Renew this year. He can't be he's a very patient big, a guy that wants to, feel everything out before he makes his move. He's got to be a lot quicker this year, a lot more dynamic in certain ways. So for the team to have success this year, I think everyone knows what everybody else is bringing on this team besides the wild cards that we mentioned with Bryson Tucker and Ja'Kai Newton. I think everyone knows what those guys are bringing to this team. At the end of the day, you do know what Mackenzie Mbako and Malik Renew are going to bring to this team, but I think those guys are just got to take their game to a new level. They got to have to take it to a first-team All-Big Ten level, in my opinion, for this team to be really, really elite this year. And obviously competing for a Big Ten championship and hopefully a deep run in the NCAA tournament.
Kyler, what is coming up for you on HoosierIllustrated.com? I know you put out a few different pieces, including the top 25 impact transfers and the Indiana guys who were involved in that. And you also have a piece on Umar Ballo out. What else you got going on?
Yeah, so obviously a lot of different content right now, a lot of recruiting content. Visits are about to pop up. So we'll be covering that on HoosierIllustrated.com. But I'm starting my series. Umar Ballo was just released yesterday, I think. So I'm just starting my newcomer focus series. Is basically I'm going to look at all the newcomers coming in, all 7 of them, recap, where they came from, just kind of recapping where they came from, and then obviously looking at the role for the upcoming year. Kind of similar how I did my returner focus series with the returners coming back this year. Pretty much the same thing with the newcomers. So I'll have that released throughout the coming weeks. And obviously football is right around the corner. So we're going to have a ton of football content. Football is going to be really heavy this next month of August and probably through September.
Ready. Bring it on. I am fiending for football, man.
I am too, obviously. So, and then obviously 3 times a week we'll have this show. So
that's right.
Obviously check it out and everything. It's been great so far. I've enjoyed every single episode. So, hit that like and subscribe button for sure. But
that's why he's the king. Kyler Staley, everybody, from HoosierIllustrated.com. Give him a follow on Twitter as well, at Kyler Staley. And be sure to check on everything that him and Alec and the whole staff at HoosierIllustrated.com are doing. Good talking to you as always, and I look forward to it next week, my friend.
Yes, sir. See you later.
Good stuff there from Kyler Staley, as always. Appreciate him taking the time to talk some basketball. I'm sure he enjoyed it. I'm glad he enjoyed it as well. And look forward to having him on again over the, throughout the season. And hearing his thoughts. We're thinking about deep diving into some of the individual players leading up to the official start of college basketball season. And it'll be here before we know it. I mean, I know college football comes first, and there's a lot of hype surrounding the Hoosiers and Kurt Signetti. And of course, I'm the first to admit that I'm overly excited about that. But I mean, right in the middle, sandwiched right in the middle, is the beginning of college basketball season. And for a lot of times, it's college football, or at least Indiana football, has been the just kind of like, we can deal with this, or we're waiting for Indiana basketball. I hope that stops being the case, just being the holdover, because for so many other programs, college football is where it's their bread and butter. It's where they make their money. And I'm not saying Indiana doesn't make their money from football, because it does. I mean, it does still hold 50,000 plus seats. I mean, it's always going to be a significantly larger draw just in terms of the overall amount of people you can fit into a stadium. But really drives things home in Indiana is obviously basketball. And that's not the case for nearly every other program in Division I college sports, mostly college basketball. But I mean, programs like Louisville, Kentucky, North Carolina, I mean, obviously your top 5 to 10 basketball programs, those are the ones that, they live and die by basketball. But I mean, when you look at the Ohio States, Michigan, nearly the entirety of the SEC, I mean, they live and die by football, and And to them, basketball is complimentary. And I'd love to live in a world where Indiana can be one of those schools where they can live off the success of both their football and their basketball program. There's only a select few programs that have the best of both worlds. And I guess if you're looking at last year specifically, I mean, Alabama, I mean, I know they didn't win the entire thing in football last year, but they were still in the college football playoff. And on top of that, basketball under, gosh, why am I forgetting his name? Basketball went to the Final Four is what I'm getting at. But what the hell is his name? Excuse me for getting frustrated, but I am blanking on Alabama's men's basketball coach. He's the guy who was formerly at Buffalo, and I'm not going to be able to move on until I figure out his name. If you can't tell, I'm Googling it right now. And that's the one thing I love, and I have a love-hate relationship with when it comes to doing live. And not this is live, I know it's pre-recorded, but I don't want to have to like cut it out. But anyway, with doing radio, it's very easy, or doing anything where you're recording, it's very easy just to get lost in your thoughts and you forget the simplest of things. And this is one of those, and that's Nate Oates. That's the head coach I'm trying to think of. Anyway, Nate Oates led Alabama to their first, I believe it's their first Final Four last year, and only in his 5th season. And so anyway, my point being, I'd love to see Indiana kind of find that world, that very rare world where you can have a successful football and basketball program. I'm not saying you have to win championships in both, but just to where you can be excited about both seasons year in and year out. And we haven't really had that. It seems like any year that Indiana football was successful recently, basketball was horrible. In 2019 and 20, in the brunt of the Archie Miller era, that's when football had their best successes, at least in this century, I should say. And basketball was terrible. And then what's funny, right when things shifted and you bring Mike Woodson back and things start to relatively turn around for Indiana basketball, football started sucking again. So I'd love to see that changed where we can have 2 good years in the 2 major sports at the same time. So we'll have to wait and see. I know I've said that a bunch this episode, I feel like, but that's really where we're at. We'll have to wait and see. And I'm tired of waiting and seeing. I'm ready to see some action. I'm ready for Kurt Signetti to take the field with Indiana football on August 31st. And we're ready to go from there and just kind of see how things play out, because there's a lot of promise, a lot of favorability with the schedule. And hopefully the Hoosiers make the most of the opportunities given to them this year. So we'll move forward. And I know I talked about fantasy football with Kyler Staley as well. And he gave me a lot of great, I guess, advice, pointers, if you will. And I could tell that he's somebody who's really, really gets into the NFL and fantasy football. So it was good to get his thoughts on whether or not I should do it. And I think I might. I'm not going to sit here and claim that I 100% will, just because I do want to kind of be all in. I don't want to just do it. Because here's the thing. If I do it and I just kind of throw it together, I'll feel like I'm just not only wasting my time, but wasting the person's time that I've joined their group. And they're like, oh, why did I even invite this guy? He just doesn't give a crap, I guess. So, but speaking of that, really speaking of the NFL, preseason football started last night. And I'm not the biggest, I don't sit there and get excited for preseason NFL football. I know it's kind of there just to begin the signs of, okay, yeah, the NFL is back, and it's a good opportunity for the second and third string guys to really get some reps in case they're called upon during the regular season and that type of stuff. But it's not really a good indicator of what a certain team is going to be like. So I don't really look too much into the results. If you're somebody who gets excited about preseason football, then good for you. I honestly kind of wish that college football would adopt some sort of preseason as well. And I don't think it needs to be 3 weeks, but what I would love to see, and I don't know if this will ever happen, but a lot of people complain about playing FCS opponents and that kind of counting as a regular season game. And I don't mind if Indiana or any team plays one FCS opponent a year. I do think I don't know if there's like an actual limit you can have. I do know most power programs don't play more than one. You'll play G5 programs and stuff like that, and that's fine. But the FCS game, especially if you don't play it in the first game of the season, it feels like it's just kind of a throwaway game. And not in the sense that like the reps aren't important and that type of thing. You just don't learn a lot about your team against the FCS opponents. So, for example, with Indiana, they'll start off the year, they'll face FIU. That's an FBS opponent, of course. They're in the top tier of Division I. But in week 2, they replaced Louisville for Western Illinois, and I get it, understandably so. You want to get something that's more of a guaranteed win. But it's really a step back in competition. And you don't really learn a whole lot from week 1 to week 2. It's going to be more of the same, more than likely. It may even be more of a beatdown, and realistically, it should. Any Power 4 program that loses to an FCS team in their non-conference schedule has problems. It's one thing to lose to maybe like a North Dakota State who was dominant at the FCS level for years in and years out, and they've always thrived at it. That's one thing, especially if that team goes out and beats like a Vanderbilt or something, or somebody who's typically like they just don't have the resources of the bigger programs. But if you're going out and losing to a Western Illinois or an Indiana State, really the majority of the FCS programs, that's just not acceptable. And what I wish they would do to replace including the FCS games in the regular season, and you can almost even do this in the spring instead of the spring game, like instead of playing against yourself as an exhibition game, play 1 or 2 FCS opponents just to get some real reps against opposition, and it doesn't have to count for anything. You can be a little more risky. You can play guys who are further down your depth chart, and the score still doesn't have to matter, but it can be. You can treat it more like the NFL preseason. And again, I don't know if something like that will happen down the road. I think I'd like to see it just as a change. It's kind of, this isn't the exact same thing, but it's kind of like when you think of the Elam ending with the TBT and how that kind of changes basketball a little bit. Again, not really the same thing. It's just a change that could happen in basketball, and not realistically change. But like if it did happen, it would just be, there's a chance it could improve the game. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because we talked about it on a previous show that I was working on, or a show that I work on in the afternoons, I should say. But again, that's neither here nor there. But yeah, NFL preseason is here. It means we're just a few weeks away from the actual NFL. And I'll tell you what, some of you are probably going to be upset about this. I've never really had a team in the NFL until recently. I casually said I was a Colts fan just because I kind of felt like I had to, just because, it was the local team. I grew up in Indiana, or at least the Indiana area most of my life. I'm now living in Kentucky, the Louisville area. And, have lived here now the majority of my, really all of my adult life, I should say. I grew up my childhood in Southern Indiana in Jeffersonville. And then some of my family members are Colts fans, and that's just kind of where that happened. But I never really had that emotional attachment to the Colts or really any professional team the way that I did with the Indiana Hoosiers teams. And so for years, I just kind of casually watched the Colts, and I would, I'd want them to win. They were, quote unquote, my team, even though it wasn't. Yeah, like I said earlier, it never felt the same like IU did. But so recently, I may have mentioned this. If I haven't mentioned it on this show, I've mentioned it on either the Out of Touch podcast or maybe a different show. But I've got a family member that lives up in Buffalo, New York, and I'm sure some of you already know where this is going by this point. But it's the same stepbrother that I mentioned earlier. His name's Hunter, and he's one of the guys who's trying to get me to do fantasy football this year. But he lives up in Buffalo, New York. And when my wife and I went up there to visit a couple of years ago, they took us to a Buffalo Bills sports bar. And it was the very first time that I had ever gone to, and my wife especially. She's a very important piece to this puzzle, I should say. went to the Buffalo Bills sports bar, and my wife's never really been a big football. Like she's learned to enjoy it from watching me watch Indiana and other sports and that type of stuff, or other teams, I should say. And she both her and I went to Western Kentucky University, and so she enjoyed watching WKU football as well. And they always had a very successful team when we were down there. But it was the Bills Steelers game in 2022, I believe. And my wife just ate it up. She was loving the Bills Mafia. The entire vibe around, like, it's just the way that the bar was themed around the Bills, and everybody there was really just, and by the way, the Bills kicked the Steelers behind in that game. And so there was a lot of excitement. It was just something that I guess my wife, I mean, myself too, neither one of us had ever been exposed to. And my wife from there on was like, I'm a Bills fan. And she was like, you got to be a Bills fan too, because I can't have you, just being a Colts fan and then we just, disagree or get along. And I don't really care either way. I've now claimed the Bills as my team, and it's mainly for my wife. And she really has. This is the first time outside of WKU that I've seen my wife really get attached to a team. And so by association now, I am a Bills fan. And I know for you Colts lifers that are probably listening to this, that's probably a crying shame. And I don't dislike the Colts. They're always going to be, the second team that I root for, I guess. But I guess that leads into my next thing, and that me and my wife will be attending our very first NFL game in person this year. And in week 10, when the Buffalo Bills visit Indianapolis at Lucas Oil Stadium, we will be there, but not as Colts fans. We'll be there as Bills fans. So if you happen to run into us down the road on that fateful November day, be nice to us. We're not mean Bills fans. We're not really a part of the Bills Mafia. My wife, she can maybe kind of say she is, but she's not going to be jumping off tables. She's not going to be, I don't know, wrestling people in the parking lot, whatever it is the Bills Mafia does. And I know they're an insane bunch, but we're just kind of Bills fans that live in Kentucky. And she takes it way more seriously than I do, and more power to her, because I think it's kind of cool to see my wife get into a sports team. I've known my wife, her name's Alicia, by the way. I've known her for, I've known her for over 10 years. We haven't been together for that long. Been kind of close to that amount of time. We've been married for, next year will be our 5th anniversary. But we've been together for longer than that. But up until the last couple of years, she never really took a genuine interest in a sports team. Most of her family are Kentucky fans, and that's a big no for me. I can't deal with the UK stuff. I can't be a fan of it. I've learned to tolerate it, being around it so much down here in the living in Kentucky, but I could not. I can't pretend to like Kentucky, and I've let her know that. She didn't get it at first because she wasn't a diehard, but from my perspective, I just can't. And I'm sure a lot of you Indiana fans agree. You just can't be a Kentucky fan, and for many of you, especially in the Southern Indiana area, it feels like Kentucky is more of a rival than Purdue. And Kentucky fans, I know they'll disagree, and rightfully so. Kentucky versus Louisville will always take precedent for them, and nothing will ever change that. But for Kentucky fans to deny that Indiana's a rival, that's just petty stuff right there. And I'm excited to see that rivalry renew in basketball next year. It's kind of dumb the way that the format of where the games will be played at is how that's going to take place, and that's all John Calipari's fault. But I am excited to see that come back. I'd love to see the battle for the bourbon barrel come back in football. I was never old enough to really remember those games, and especially now that Kentucky is a lot more formidable in football. I mean, maybe it's not something you'd want to see as an Indiana fan right now, but down the road, if Indiana gets things rolling, why not bring back the bourbon barrel? So we'll see. I actually doubt that ever happens, because I do believe there was a big like legal issue or something along the lines, or maybe there was a big problem with why the Bourbon Barrel game is no longer played. And some of you may be even able to give me the details on that. I've read about it before. I don't remember the story off the top of my head on why that trophy or game ceases to exist. But I do know there is a reason. They didn't just stop doing it. So yeah, I guess with all that being said, that I really just veered off an interesting path there, talking about NFL and the Bills. But see, I'll be attending my first NFL game at Lucas Oil Stadium this year, seeing the Bills take on the Colts, and both my wife and I are very excited about that. Let's get into a couple more things, maybe just one or two more things at the most before we wrap up this on a Friday. Did any of you see the darts only post on Twitter? I think it was a couple days ago. Colorado football, and Colorado football's kind of become the punching bag for the power football programs with Deion Sanders, and they kind of just get in their own way. I don't want to say they make fun of themselves, but they act like they're way better than everybody else, and they suck. And that started last year, and they really ate up the limelight that they were given early on in the season. They had that college game day matchup to start the year with TCU, and TCU was thought to be decent. And, they were coming off the college football playoff appearance, and Colorado goes down to TCU and beats them in Deion Sanders' debut. And that got people thinking, uh-oh, Deion's here. He's going to get this train rolling, and Colorado is going to be dangerous. And they started off the year, I believe, 3 or 4-0. Maybe, I think it was. And then I believe they lost like 8 straight games. They finished the season 4-8. And that train fell off the tracks very quickly. And I think this will be kind of the year. If they don't really take a step forward, I think the shtick might be kind of up for Deion Sanders and crew. But anyway, the Colorado Twitter account posted a couple of video clips that looked like it was one play, but it was clearly something that was mashed together to make it look better than it actually was. And if you haven't seen it, if you just go on Twitter and search darts only, not only will you see the original Colorado tweet, but you'll see other programs. Arkansas did it. Troy did it. I think there's probably several others that I can't even think of. Those are just the two off the top of my head that I saw that showed their version of darts only, making fun of Colorado. And it's a video of Shedeur Sanders, Colorado's quarterback, and Deion's son, throwing a pass, and then at the last second before you see the catch on the original cut, it switches to a different camera angle, and you can't even. It's clear to see that it's doctored footage, and so it's just kind of goofy. It's Colorado again doing something that seems very on brand for Deion Sanders and company, and I hate to say it, but I just hope they fail. Deion, I don't know if any of you pay attention, how much of you are on Twitter. And I'm really not even that big of a fan of social media when it comes down to it. I use it because I have to, and I do get some enjoyment out of it every now and again. But it's just a cesspool. And you've seen players this offseason for Colorado just saying some nasty things to people, whether it be former players who have left the program, Colorado's program being, and just it's just very, this might sound, it's very Friday Night Lights-ish. It's just overly dramatic and not necessary and very unprofessional. And especially in an era where college football really has kind of become semi-pro sports when you think about how they're getting paid and all that kind of stuff. So it's just, Colorado football is just, they're in a world of their own, and they act like their crap don't stink in an effort to not say the true version of that phrase. But I'd love to see Colorado fail and just move on from the Deion Sanders experiment. Because here's the thing. If they don't fail and they take a significant step forward this year, it'll be just like the beginning of last season where all you hear about is Deion Sanders. But I will say this. If they're good, then they deserve it. If they're good, they deserve it. And that's fine. give the good teams the credit they deserve, but it really aggravated a lot of people last year. And at first it didn't aggravate me. I mean, you saw Deion Sanders in countless commercials. I mean, he was in commercials for like almonds. I don't know if you remember. I don't remember which brand it was, but you couldn't hardly find a commercial at the beginning of college football season that didn't include Deion Sanders. So that's where we're at with that. And I think we're going to go ahead and wrap things up for this week. So good week of shows. Happy Friday once again to everybody. Again, thanks for taking the time, and I look forward to doing it again next week. We'll have Alec on Monday, I believe, and we'll try to bring on a special guest or two next week. And more. I think the schedule is going to be, at least in terms of a couple regulars, especially the Hoosier Illustrated guys. I think Alec is going to make appearances on Mondays, and I think Kyler is going to make appearances on Fridays, at least for now. That may change. So Wednesday's guest will be a revolving door of different people. Hopefully we can make it as big of a variety as possible, and we'll continue to make changes throughout the season. Again, I've talked about aspirations to do live shows. I'm still thinking about the best way to implement that and give that a test run. And I'm also looking forward to, once we get into football season, to doing some post-game reaction type shows. So yeah, a lot of things to get excited about. So thank you as always. Be sure to check out HoosierIllustrated.com to see what those guys just mentioned are writing about. Alec Lasley, Kyler Staley, and the entire gang. Drew Rosenberg as well. I know he hasn't made an appearance on the show, but he is another wonderful contributor to the Hoosier Illustrated staff, and they've got tons of good things. If you've never checked out the website, honestly, if you've made it here, you've probably checked out the website. But if you happen to have only ever seen this show and have never checked out HoosierIllustrated.com, it's one of the most professional-looking sports websites, especially Indiana-centric sports websites that you can find out there. So check them out. A lot of good stories on there, and subscribe to the YouTube page. We've appreciated the early growth from this new show for what it's done to the site, but subscribe to Hoosier Illustrated on YouTube. Leave a comment, like the show, share it with your friends, especially if you've got friends who enjoy Indiana-related content, and we'll keep bringing this to you Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays right here on HoosierIllustrated.com. So until Monday, appreciate you as always. We'll be back with it once again